Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my wide receiver tier list for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be going over a comprehensive list of the top to bottom wide receivers as we approach our 2021 fantasy football draft. Of course, I'll be giving you guys my thought process and opinions as to how I kind of think this is going to break down going into this upcoming season, but I'll give you the stats that also justify my thought process. Of course, we'll be breaking them down in a tier-based list, of course, from S to I tier. Now, just because a player is in the G, H, or I tier overall doesn't mean that they're not being drafted. Every single player I mentioned on today's video is going to be drafted and is going to have an immense amount of value in our upcoming season in the whole grand scheme of helping us win a 2021 fantasy football championship. Now, of course, if you want to continue to help yourself potentially win a 2021 fantasy football championship, there's a couple ways, and I'm going to suggest that to you. Number one, of course, go down below and subscribe to the channel. We're going to be helping you guys win a 2021 fantasy football championship with the amount of content we continue to put out. Of course, I'm making fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, whether it is tier-based system, rankings on a weekly basis at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback position, Sunday morning live streams to help you get your lineup set before kickoff. Everything this offseason up until now has been kind of low-key, but now that we've gone into the full stride and we're about to get into draft weekends, of course, we'll be having more mock draft videos, must-draft players this upcoming season at every single position. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the content so far, and of course, join the community and help us reach our goal of 40,000 subscribers by clicking down below. Thank you very much. Another way to, again, gain an advantage on your league before we begin today's video is by getting Andrew Kirchhoff's 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. For those of you who are interested, you can go down below into the description of the video and find either the Patreon or the website. If you're interested there are videos on both of those sites that kind of explain to you what is inside of the 2021 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Thank you very much for those of you who have already gone and purchased and support over there on Patreon. Thank you very much. All right, now, also, if you're down in the description, before we begin, the timestamps are down there. Today's video is going to be for a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a full or standard scoring format. So meeting everyone in the middle, I'm ready to go. We've got a lot of players to talk about, but let's begin with, in my opinion, the number one wide receiver on the season, Davante Adams. It really isn't a surprise that Davante Adams is up here in the S tier because there haven't been many wide receivers that have shown year-over-year consistency, and Davante Adams since 2018 has done that and has been the number one wide receiver in my opinion just based on his overall productivity. Since 2018, he's averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game in the 40 games that he's played overall. And yes, he missed 4 games in 2019 and even missed 2 games this past season. He has still been able to fight through injury and be a consistent producer, mainly because, again, he's associated with Aaron Rodgers. Luckily, Aaron Rodgers is, of course, going to have another season in Green Bay, and because of his touchdown totals and the amount of targets he gets in his respective offense. But, I mean, when we go back and we saw what he did last year and the accomplishments he had in said offense, he was averaging 22.75 fantasy points per game in the 14 contests he played. Of course, we're not going to include the game where he left early in the first quarter against the Detroit Lions. But overall, he's had himself a successful career, and it's mainly been on the back or the stability of being Aaron Rodgers' number one. You know, when we look at the last decade plus of what Aaron Rodgers' number one wide receivers are doing, it's always been 10 plus touchdowns, over 130 targets, you know, somewhere near the 100 reception range, you know, at least 1,300 receiving yards, whether it was Jordy Nelson, whether it was Randall Cobb in the past. We've always seen success there. Davante Adams has, of course, taken the torch and certainly ran away with it. Since 2016, he has led all wide receivers with total touchdowns with 58. He's had 4 out of the last 5 seasons with 10 plus touchdowns. Of course, the only season in which he didn't accomplish that was the season, of course, 2019, where he didn't play a full year. Just giving you some perspective, Davante Adams, of course, fantasy point-wise, he's been unstoppable. Touchdown-wise, he's been great. And because of how much opportunity he gets in this offense, the yardage is always going to follow. In the last 40 games he's played since 2018, he's had 17 contests of over 100 receiving yards. That's just fantastic. No one can really keep up. But the only other wide receiver, in my opinion, that can theoretically keep up is Tyreek Hill, because Tyreek Hill is just as active in the passing game when we talk about touchdowns. And yes, he is a big play wide receiver, always is going to have the threat of the deep ball, considering he is the fastest wide receiver in the National Football League on that field. every single Sunday. He's torching defenders. I mean, I think it was just yesterday during the preseason game, he's just torching Minnesota, cornerbacks in the first quarter like it's nothing. And that's just something he's going to continue to carry on year over year. Since 2018, Tyreek Hill's averaged 17.85 fantasy points per game. He's had 11 games of 100 plus receiving yards. And of course, like I mentioned, the touchdowns have certainly been there. Since 2018, he has led all wide receivers in total touchdowns with 37. Now, in comparison to Davante Adams is only just one touchdown behind him with 36 total. But that being said, of course, we've seen Tyreek Hill, when he's healthy, produce back-to-back seasons of 10-plus touchdowns in 2018 and in 2020. Of course, he did miss time due to injuries in 2019, similar to Davante Adams. So it's pretty obvious. Both of these wide receivers have both finished as the number one overall wide receiver. Tyreek Hill in 2018, Davante Adams in 2020. Both of them missed time in 2019, and that's why they both deserve to be at the top of this list, because of how much productivity they've seen year over year. Tyreek Hill, of course, on top of the fact that he's getting the deep ball accuracy with Patrick Mahomes and making a lot of plays there, he's, of course, able to get work done on the ground. In 2018 and in 2020, when he's been fully healthy, he's averaged about 141 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns a season. That's great. I mean, in terms of an option on a weekly basis, being able to get extra points in any sort of facet. I know he doesn't play in the special teams department anymore, but he used to do it everywhere on the field, all 3 facets of the game. But in terms of his volatility, because I know a lot of people mention it, yes, Tyreek Hill has a little bit of volatility. He has just as many games of 25 plus points than he has less than 10 points. And that's going to happen, but I'll take that, considering this is a wide receiver that in any given week could go for 40 fantasy points. He's just an unstoppable force. We love to see it. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next tier of players, beginning with Calvin Ridley. I think Calvin Ridley is one of my favorite wide receivers going into this year, because though he had an incredible season last year, with the absence of Julio Jones for majority of that, a lot of people aren't really giving him the respect that he deserves. I mean, he's coming off of a season in which he averaged 16.48 fantasy points per game, had 8 games of 100 total receiving yards, 9 total touchdowns last year. I mean, what more could we ask for? Yes, he has scored a lot of touchdowns in his past. I mean, just in the 3 years of his career since 2018, he scored 26 total touchdowns in 42 total games. Those are great statistics overall. Now that you don't have the presence of Julio Jones in this lineup, I mean, all the targets should be going in the direction of Calvin Ridley, which I absolutely expect to see. In the last, 10 years of Julio Jones' career with the Atlanta Falcons, if we went ahead and broke his statistics down on a per-game basis, his per-game statistics is pretty much 10 targets per game over the past decade for the Atlanta Falcons. Shouldn't really be much of a surprise. The amount of opportunity that Julio Jones has gotten has definitely led to his success, which I think, of course, Calvin Ridley is going to inherit immediately in this offense. I know there are other threats like Kyle Pitts coming into this offense, but it is not going to stop Calvin Ridley from being the number one for a Matt Ryan-led offense. Again, last season, with the absence of Julio Jones, a lot of people may have anticipated, Calvin Ridley's going to regress because now he has to go against number one corner coverage instead of having the ability and the potential of going against number twos and dominating against them. That really wasn't the case. In the absence of Julio Jones, in the 8 games overall that they played without Julio last year with the Atlanta Falcons, he averaged 16.25 fantasy points per game. Incredible numbers. And on top of it, with Julio not on the field, and like I mentioned, the targets and the opportunities going in Calvin Ridley's direction, in the 19 games in his career that he's at 8+ targets, he's averaged 19.09 fantasy points per game. All things kind of lead and point towards the direction of an incredible season for Calvin Ridley here in 2021. That's what I expect. Stefon Diggs is our next wide receiver option in this tier. I think Stefon Diggs is a fantastic player. Did I expect him to finish as the number 3 overall guy in half PPR last year? Absolutely not, because I didn't expect Josh Allen to take that much of a step forward. But of course, the presence of Stefon Diggs, more experience under his belt, and kind of giving Josh Allen a little bit of that help that he needed, really took him to the next level, and that was absolutely fantastic to see. Stefon Diggs, of course, last season averaged 16.57 fantasy points per game. In the 16 games he played, he had 14 games of 8+ targets. Imagine that kind of opportunity. And in the only 2 games that he didn't have 8+ targets, he had 100 receiving yards, and in the other game, a receiving touchdown. So in terms of his fantasy point productivity, it was there every single week of the season. This is a wide receiver that, if in fact he's going to continue to see this kind of opportunity, he led all wide receivers in total targets last year, only I think barely ahead of DeAndre Hopkins, but nonetheless, he led all wide receivers in targets in an offense that threw the ball 59.19% of the time, which was ranked 12th amongst all teams in total passing attempts. Of course, they want to throw the ball. Of course, they have the entire offense built around the gunslinger Josh Allen and feeding Stefon Diggs the rock. I think that's just going to continue to be the case with the opportunity going in his direction and seeing the ball 8+ times a game for majority of the season. It just seems like it's an automatic that Stefon Diggs is going to find some success. And though I expect Josh Allen to have a little bit of regression this year, maybe he doesn't take a step back. Maybe they take a step forward and both these guys benefit accordingly. I think Stefon Diggs is a fantastic option this year and another great one in this A tier. Now, when we're going to be talking about these A tier wide receivers, of course, Stefon Diggs isn't really generally been talked about an A tier wide receiver in his career. Neither has Calvin Ridley. They're both younger wide receivers, but a wide receiver that's been in the league for the last couple years and has been Mr. Consistency at the position is without a doubt DeAndre Hopkins. In the last 4 consecutive seasons, he has been a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy and a half PPR scoring format. On top of that, in those last 5 seasons, he has not missed a single game due to an injury. He is a tough son of a gun, and he obviously is going to be on the field every single week, and he's found a lot of consistency and maintain his top of the chart standing regardless of who's been at the quarterback position. Even in years prior to Deshaun Watson, he was playing with garbage cans, and then he got Watson. He's gone ahead and now has Murray as his quarterback, and I think it's just a perfect recipe for success for DeAndre Hopkins going forward. Last year, like I mentioned, he was only second to Stefon Diggs in total targets at 160 total targets. Again, that's 10 targets per game. You can't ask for anything more. On top of the fact that DeAndre Hopkins had a 71.87% catch rate last year, averaging 14.39 fantasy points per game. Now, the only thing that DeAndre Hopkins didn't do last year that we'd love to see him kind of progress and where his potential ceiling lies is in the touchdown department. In the last couple of years, he hasn't been as effective down in the red zone. Hopefully, this offense will continue to give him more opportunities down there. Now that they don't have a Kenyon Drake, potentially we could end up seeing DeAndre Hopkins get a couple more targets. Of course, they have brought in other wide receivers that are going to take pressure away from him and maybe targets away from him. We'll see how that all kind of plays out this year. But honestly, DeAndre Hopkins, in my opinion, considering the fact that he has been a top 5 wide receiver for 4 consecutive years, I have no other reason to think that he's not going to continue that in 2021. That's why he maintains there. We have Justin Jefferson as our next option here. So Justin Jefferson, besides having one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time, I think he was only second to Odell Beckham Jr. in terms of total fantasy points by a rookie wide receiver in the past decade. Justin Jefferson is just continuing to take the next step this offseason. Of course, has really established himself, in my opinion, as the number 1 overall wide receiver of this Minnesota Vikings offense. Of course, Adam Thielen had a year last year where he had himself 14 receiving touchdowns and 900 plus receiving yards. And we're talking about Justin Jefferson taking that next step and being the wide receiver 1. Imagine that. Of course, we all know Justin Jefferson had himself 1,400 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns. Great overall season. But to be honest, Justin Jefferson was kind of handicapped for a little bit of that season. From the jump, Justin Jefferson wasn't the starter for the Minnesota Vikings. In fact, he only played as the starter in week 3 of the season and on. And even then, there were a couple games, one against Indianapolis, where he wasn't given the full opportunity. He didn't play 70+% of the offensive snaps. In games that he was allowed to play full opportunity, be the number 1 wide receiver of this team, playing 70+% of the offensive snaps, the guy was averaging 17.39 fantasy points per game. Anytime he had below 70% of the offensive snaps, only averaged 5.37. Again, not the starter and not the focal point of the offense versus the actual starter and the guy that is going to continue to grow year over year and prove that he is one of the stud wide receivers in this National Football League. Overall, I think Justin Jefferson is a fantastic option in terms of the regression we saw from Adam Thielen late last season after he came back from his injury from weeks 13 through 17. All signs point to Justin Jefferson taking the next step forward in terms of target percentage, red zone target percentage, and overall productivity per opportunity. He's a fantastic option. The last player I wanted to mention in the A tier is DK Metcalf. Now, when I thought about players that really encompass the A tier, I'm thinking of players that honestly could line up in any order. We could put DK Metcalf in front of Calvin Ridley here. It wouldn't matter because if DK finishes the number 3 overall wide receiver, we wouldn't be surprised because we've seen consistency and a growth year over year in his career. And to be honest, I think it's only going to get better for DK Metcalf. Last season, he averaged 14.36 fantasy points per game, but many of us benefited from the fact that in the beginning of the year, he was unstoppable with Russell Wilson. The guy was averaging about like 17 fantasy points per game for the first 7 or 8 weeks. I mean, on that pace, if he had continued on, he would have finished as the number 1 overall wide receiver, or in the conversation to say the very least, because of course Davante Adams missed a little bit of time there. But DK Metcalf was on fire early and wasn't really looking to stop anytime soon. He had a total of 10 games of 8+ targets, 5 games of 100+ receiving yards. Again, like I mentioned, has been a touchdown fiend in the past, had 10 touchdowns last year, which is fantastic. Now, when we kind of go over DK Metcalf's potential going into the 2021 season, where do we see it? Of course, he's one of the best wide receivers, specifically because of his stature. He is a big body wide receiver, and he's one of the fastest. Again, this offseason, tried to make the Olympics, was in the trials, trying to, the 100-meter sprint. The guy is an absolute freak of nature. He's the Terminator. When we look at the statistics that define DK Metcalf, in the last 2 years, he's had 10 touchdowns from passes of 20+ yards. He's had the most receptions since 2019 of 30+ receiving yards, and he's had the most end zone targets amongst all wide receivers in the league with 32. On top of the fact that they changed their offensive coordinator to Shane Waldron, formerly of the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams in the last couple of years, in terms of passing opportunity, have ranked 12th, 3rd, and 14th amongst all teams in the National Football League, while the Seattle Seahawks have ranked 32nd, 23rd, and 17th in passing attempts. I think this offense will let Russ cook and in turn allow DK Metcalf to take that next step this upcoming season. Going from averaging 14.36 fantasy points per game, I can honestly tell you from the bottom of my heart, I think he can jump into that 16, 17 point range and easily be a top 5 wide receiver this upcoming season. It's just a matter of what this offense is going to limit Russell Wilson to, because as long as Russell is allowed to continue to throw the rock all season long and defenses aren't figuring him out, I don't think anybody can stop DK. He's just too much of a freak of nature. We move on to A.J. Brown, a former teammate from Ole Miss of DK Metcalf. These two guys, they are unbelievable. And of course, we've seen them both blossom in their first 2 seasons of their career. A.J. Brown, since Ryan Tannehill took the job in 2019, Week 7 against the Los Angeles Chargers, he has been a fantastic wide receiver option, averaging 14.88 fantasy points per game. In the 24 games that Ryan Tannehill and A.J. Brown have played in together, A.J. Brown hasn't seen that much opportunity. He's only had 9 games of 8+ targets, and amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League, his target counts are not great. We'll end up seeing him finish with 5 targets in a week, and yes, he'll have 80 receiving yards, 4 catches, and 2 touchdowns, and we'll forget about the fact that he wasn't given much opportunity because the fantasy points were there, but it's been crazy to see how much of a lack of opportunity A.J. Brown has seen. But of course, he's been able to compensate with the fact that the guy scored 17 touchdowns in the last 2 seasons. That statistic alone has certainly carried him, and though there could be the potential of regression, I do see that there's a potential that Julio Jones comes in, gets a lot of targets, but again, we're missing JuJu Smith in that offense. We no longer have Corey Davis. Those opportunities can go in the direction of Julio, and I think A.J. Brown could have a solid floor. A thing that I've mentioned this offseason is that A.J. Brown had surgery on both of his knees this offseason. The doctors told him, week 3 of last season, that he was done and he probably needed a season-ending injury. He fought through them. At practice, the guy has been seen to pretty much be in a wheelchair because he couldn't walk throughout the week because of how much pain he was in. I think if he's fully healthy this year and ready to go, I don't think anybody can stop A.J. Brown except for, of course, this offense and the amount of opportunities they give him. Because if they want to go ahead and light him up for 160 targets, the guy's going to be the number 1 all season long. In fact, last season, if he had not missed those 2 games early in the year, the guy would have finished as the number 4 overall wide receiver with 242 points because he was averaging 15.17 fantasy points per game just in 2020 alone. So again, the stats are there. They play against the AFC South. Those teams just can't stop him. He's averaged 18.09 fantasy points per game in his career against them. He's just such a fun player to watch and guy that's going to continue to grow going into year 3. All right, we have Keenan Allen as our next wide receiver. Again, Keenan Allen, absolute stud of a wide receiver. With Justin Herbert last year, he averaged 16.12 fantasy points per game. In the 11 games that he played that he was healthy, in 10 of those contests, he had 10+ targets. Now, that's the opportunity that I want to see from my respective wide receivers. Last year, he had 7 touchdowns and 4 games of 100+ receiving yards. The statistics on a per-game basis were crazy. He was averaging 12.18 targets per game, 8.45 receptions per game, 83 receiving yards per game and 0.64 receiving touchdowns per game if he had played a full healthy season last year, especially considering the fact that he didn't play against the Raiders twice, which are the easiest matchups for wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format last season. He would have finished with about 264 fantasy points last season, which is an insane amount of points. We never see Keenan Allen do that because Keenan Allen's mainly been a guy that, yes, he's going to catch the ball in the end zone maybe 5 times in a given year. He's going to have the solidified value of catching the ball over 100 times. In fact, in the 4 years prior to Justin Herbert arriving with Phillip Rivers, Keenan Allen was pretty much an automatic to catch the ball over 100 times. In the last 4 seasons, 102 receptions, 97 receptions, 104 receptions, and then 100 receptions. The PPR value there, incredible. If the touchdowns are going to go up, the yards are going to go up, and Herbert's going to continue to funnel target him, I don't think Keenan Allen is being valued as much as a lot of people kind of give him the respect. He's going in the 3rd round right now and could very easily be a top 8 wide receiver this season. We have Allen Robinson as the next wide receiver in this tier. I think Allen Robinson's kind of, against all odds, been one of the better wide receivers considering his opportunity and the teams that he's played on. Yes, in terms of an opportunity basis, he's had back-to-back seasons of 150-plus targets. No other wide receiver except for DeAndre Hopkins has had more targets than him in the last 2 years, which is a very ridiculous statistic. In the last 2 seasons, in the 32 games he's played for the Chicago Bears, he's had 21 games of 8+ targets. In those games in which he's had 8+ targets, he's averaged 15.53 fantasy points per game. When we think about what he's done in his career with the quarterbacks of Blake Bortles, Mitchell Trubisky, Nick Foles, Chad Henne in the past, he hasn't been given the greatest quarterback help. I think regardless of whether it is Andy Dalton and or Justin Fields, Allen Robinson's going to be able to produce. That's why he's at the top of this list. His finish is the number 11 and 12 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format in back-to-back seasons. I mean, when I look at Andy Dalton, I think of a guy that used to funnel target AJ Green. If he can do that for Allen Robinson early until Justin Fields comes in, and then Justin Fields will get it done, I think we've got a great option here. We move on to our next wide receiver option. We have Terry McLaurin. I think Terry McLaurin's an absolute stud as well. With Ryan Fitzpatrick at the quarterback position now, the offense is going to be significantly more improved, and I think the targets and the accuracy of the quarterback play will be better. In comparison to the quarterbacks he's faced, it's kind of like Allen Robinson in the fact that Terry McLaurin has had to deal with Haskins, Alex Smith, Heineke, Keenum, Colt McCoy in the last couple of years, and that's just not going to get the job done. When in that same time, we've seen Ryan Fitzpatrick down in Miami throwing the ball to Davante Parker. I mean, if we go back to 2019 with Davante Parker from week 6 through 17, Davante Parker was averaging 14.92 fantasy points per game and about 8.67 targets per game. The opportunity for the number 1 wide receiver associated with Ryan Fitzpatrick is certainly going to lead to success. And though Terry McLaurin has shown flashes of great overall play, averaging 11.83 fantasy points per game since he's come into the league in 2019, I think he can certainly take another step forward this year. He kind of reminds me of years past Chris Godwin and Calvin Ridley, guys that finished in the 20s and then in that following year had a blow-up season. I think that's the case this year for Terry McLaurin, and that's why I have him in this B tier. We move on to our last B tier wide receiver, another guy that I think takes a huge step forward, which is CeeDee Lamb. Currently, he's going to potentially be playing on the outside opposite of Amari Cooper. And the reason they went ahead and did this was because CeeDee Lamb is a fantastic deep threat for this team, and they want to go ahead and keep him on the field even when they're in 2 wide receiver sets in comparison to Michael Gallup. This is one of the most, if not the most talented wide receiver on this roster. And with Dak Prescott last year, when they were both healthy and in the lineup, they were an unstoppable connection. With Prescott, he led the team with 412 total receiving yards from weeks 1 through 5. Of course, had 11 receptions of 15+ yards. And throughout that time, he had the most end zone targets than the entire team combined. He had 7, while the entire rest of the team couldn't even get to that total. If you put CeeDee Lamb on the outside, and of course you potentially pull number 1 coverage with Amari Cooper on the other side of the field, I think CeeDee Lamb takes that next step forward. Last year in the 5 games, like I mentioned, that he played with Dak, he averaged 14.22 fantasy points per game and was the number 12 overall wide receiver throughout that span of time. I think this is an absolute just automatic. There's a reason why CeeDee Lamb is going as high, is because the stats are there behind the scenes. While a lot of people may be thinking Dak is not going to be healthy, I have no problem with him right now. I know his ankle is healthy. I know his shoulder is going to potentially be healing, but he'll get back on track and he'll be ready to go this season in order to help his wide receiver 1 here, CeeDee Lamb. All right, we move on to our next wide receiver, Mike Evans. The statistics that define Mike Evans are certainly consistency. He's been a wide receiver one for the last 3 consecutive seasons. Since coming into the NFL in 2014, he's had 7 consecutive seasons of 1,000+ receiving yards. With Tom Brady as his starting quarterback last season, Mike Evans averaged 13.83 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 16. But the stat that really was alarming to me was the fact that he was even better when Chris Godwin, Gronkowski, and Antonio Brown were full go in the lineup. You may have thought, okay, well, early on in the season, when Scotty Miller was the only other receiving option in this team, Mike Evans must have gone off every single week. That wasn't really the case. When there isn't as much help for Mike Evans on the field, it is not going to look as pretty when he has guys that are pulling coverage and giving him opportunities and find himself in one-on-one coverage. This is a big body wide receiver who is really tough to bring down and makes a lot of contested catches down the field. I mean, when we just talk about what he was able to do from weeks 9 through 16 when AB, Chris Godwin, Gronk were all full goes in that lineup, he was averaging 16.17 fantasy points per game, and throughout that time was the number 6 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. I think Mike Evans is going to continue to be this built-in wide receiver one for this respective team, and I think just with consistency year over year gives me that much more confidence with him. We have Diontae Johnson as the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. I've talked about Diontae a lot this season, and I think the defining stats for Diontae Johnson is opportunity. Last season, yes, he dealt with a lot of drops and he dealt with a lot of injuries. But if you go ahead and you get rid of the games in which he got injured very early in those contests, of course, oftentimes in the first half of the first quarter, Diontae Johnson had to leave the game because of a pulled hamstring or a calf injury or whatever it ended up being. When we talk about the games he played in full, when he's playing 70+% of the offensive snaps, the guy averaged 15.96 fantasy points per game. He had 11 games of 10+ targets. The only other wide receivers to accomplish that last season was, of course, Davante Adams and Keenan Allen. Joins really, really good company in the fact that he is getting a lot of opportunity in this offense. And I know a lot of people may be thinking, hey, Andrew, you know what? There's a lot of mouths to feed in that offense. You got Claypool. You've got JuJu Smith-Schuster. Targets don't lie. Diontae Johnson gets open. If he wasn't getting open as often, he wouldn't be targeted. And I understand that there's other wide receivers in this offense, but this is an offense that last year ran 3 wide receiver sets 80% of the time and have been throwing the ball 60+% of the time in 2018 and in 2020 when Ben Roethlisberger has been the starting quarterback of this team. I think Diontae Johnson's overall stability based on targets, again, seeing over 150 last year, is going to continue to build this upcoming season as he establishes himself as the number 1 of the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. All right, Robert Woods is our next option. Again, with Matthew Stafford coming into the offense, I think Robert Woods takes another step forward. Of course, Matthew Stafford's number 1 wide receivers from about 2014 after Calvin Ridley had already retired. When we talk about Marvin Jones, Kenny Golladay, his number 1 wide receiver has always found consistency, but in a couple statistics. Of course, the deep ball and touchdowns. Now, we haven't seen Marvin Jones and Kenny Golladay be guys that are going to be catching the ball 100+ times, and I don't think Robert Woods is of that kind of level, in my opinion. I don't think he's going to be able to see that many targets, much less catch the ball that many times this upcoming year. But we know based on the production of Matthew Stafford's number 1 wide receivers in years past, averaging 73 receptions, 1,082 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns, and about 200 fantasy points per year, I think Robert Woods can take the next step in comparison to when he was with Jared Goff. Last season, Robert Woods only had 5 end zone targets in the deep passing game. In terms of all quarterbacks in the National Football League, Matthew Stafford was 7th in terms of end zone passing attempts. He was 3rd in team air yards and 11th in deep ball passing attempts. All in all, I think Matthew Stafford is going to uncork this offense, give Sean McVay that ability to potentially use Robert Woods as a deep threat wide receiver. I know they brought in Deshaun Jackson, who's definitely going to pull some pressure on the other side of the field, but I still think Robert Woods is an absolute stud this year and can be an incredibly valuable pick in the 3rd, 4th round where a lot of people are sleeping on him. Amari Cooper is our next wide receiver option for today in this C tier. I think Amari Cooper sits in this range pretty comfortably considering how productive he was with Dak Prescott last year. I know he's only had a couple seasons of, rapport with Dak Prescott since being traded in with the Las Vegas Raiders, or formerly the Oakland Raiders, but Amari Cooper really took some steps forward last year, and I would have loved to see him play with Dak all of last season and see where he was going to end up, because he was on pace for being easily a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy. In fact, from weeks 1 through 4 with Dak, he had a total of 51 targets, 37 receptions for 401 receiving yards, and 1 total touchdown. It was a 16.65 fantasy point per game average, and throughout those first 4 weeks was the number 3 overall wide receiver, only behind Calvin Ridley and Tyler Lockett, who were going off. So he's pretty much averaging 12 targets, 9 receptions, and 100 receiving yards per game with an occasional touchdown 1 out of every 4 weeks. Overall, if you can find even slightly, just remotely close production to that this upcoming season, an opportunity close to that, I think there's a very good chance that Amari Cooper locks down a solidified wide receiver 2 role in terms of the entire fantasy landscape, and maybe even extends that into a lower end wide receiver 1 conversation. There could be a very good possibility where CeeDee Lamb isn't as much as we thought he was going to be in terms of this passing game, isn't seeing as much of those deep end zone targets to get him ahead of Amari Cooper, because yes, they're both going to be competing for targets, but I think CeeDee Lamb takes that edge in touchdowns, while Amari Cooper will take the edge in total receptions. And I think that's where his main value kind of locks in. He's going to get a lot of PPR receptions, going to get the yardage there, and as long as the opportunities continue to funnel in, he's going to be a great play. We move on to Chris Godwin, another wide receiver. Again, we're going to mention a lot of wide receivers that play on the same teams, because as long as these quarterbacks are continuing to funnel the ball in their direction, we're going to find a lot of success. Now, unfortunately for Chris Godwin, 2020 wasn't as beautiful. I mean, yes, he won a championship, but in terms of fantasy statistics, it wasn't as great as he was in 2019 with Jameis Winston. Of course, in 2019 finishes the number 2 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format, but last season was plagued with injuries, whether it was the concussion, the hamstring, the broken finger, which he had surgery on during the season. He was certainly plagued with injuries. But with that being said, in the 10 games that he played fully healthy and played the entire game, he averaged 14.77 fantasy points per game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, I know a lot of people may be concerned with the fact that there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense with Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, Gronk, Fournette, Ronald Jones, Scotty Miller, O.J. Howard. There's a lot of names. We understand that there's an army of wide receivers and receiving options in this offense. But to be honest, Chris Godwin has been not only one of the best slot receivers in the league, but even in the games that he returned last season and was fully healthy from weeks 10 through 17, when he sat in the slot position for this offense, the guy was an unstoppable force. In fact, from weeks 10 through 17 was a number 13 overall wide receiver in points per game and was the number 14 overall wide receiver in terms of overall productivity. In my opinion, there's going to be a lot of upside for Chris Godwin, and I think you can get him for a very good discount. Let's not forget, Tom Brady likes to target slot wide receivers. Let's go back to the days of Edelman from 2016 to 2019. Was targeting Edelman, I think, 9.54 times per game in the 44 games that they played together throughout that 4-year span. So I think, again, Chris Godwin, a lot of innate value there. If the opportunities are going to be there, since 2019, Chris Godwin, 7+ targets, has equaled 18.3 fantasy points per game. A lot of great statistics in his direction. Julio Jones is the last wide receiver of this tier. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention Julio Jones here is because, again, I still think Julio's a monster, and I don't think he's even close to retiring anytime soon. This is a future Hall of Fame wide receiver, and I think he's got a lot left in the tank. Like I mentioned earlier with Calvin Ridley, if we go ahead and take the per-game statistics of Julio Jones as of the past decade with the Atlanta Falcons, on a yearly basis, in a 16-game full season, the guy was averaging about 163 total targets, 105 receptions, 1,591 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, and about 255 fantasy points per game. Now, he goes into the Tennessee Titans offense. Yes, it's a little different. They have been more of a run-committed offense in years past, but there's going to be targets available for him. JuJu Smith is no longer there. Corey Davis is no longer there. That's 150-plus targets easily that can go into his direction and pretty much fill in exactly where he left off with the Atlanta Falcons. Though a lot of people think Julio Jones, yeah, he's injury prone, this, that. He's not going to be able to take the next step. Why do people think he's injury prone? I don't understand that thought process. All you really have to do is just go and look at his game logs. Year over year, he has been a healthy wide receiver. Prior to this last season, Julio Jones had played 92 of his 96 eligible games. Yeah, he missed 4 games since 2014 prior to the 2020 injury. Dude, he's been on the field. There was a game last year against Minnesota where the guy had over 100 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 8 receptions, 25 fantasy points plus. He is still a dominant wide receiver. He's going to prove that to many of you this upcoming season. I think he's a fantastic wide receiver option in this C tier. We go to move on to the next tier here, and we present to you the next wide receiver, Cooper Kupp. Y'all know how much I love Cooper Kupp. I mean, it shouldn't really be a surprise. He is going to find a lot of production because we've seen the slot wide receiver for Matthew Stafford's offense, specifically Golden Tate in years past, be a fantastic option. Golden Tate from 2014 through 2017 averaged 132 targets, 93 receptions, 1,056 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns a year throughout that span of time. I think Cooper Kupp is an even better wide receiver than Golden Tate. I think he can take those 132 targets and produce that much more with it, and that's why I have him in this current tier. Since 2018 with Jared Goff at the quarterback position, he's averaged about 13.16 fantasy points per game. But let's not forget, Cooper Kupp is very capable of putting up more than those kind of points. In 2019, in fact, had 94 catches for 1,161 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns, which is the big defying season for his career, considering in that season only one other wide receiver had double-digit touchdowns. So again, Cooper Kupp, a fantastic option and can be a stud in fantasy. I think Matthew Stafford only helps him get to that next level this upcoming season. We have Tyler Lockett, and I know I've heard it all, guys. I've heard it all. Tyler Lockett's inconsistent. He's too volatile. Man, look at what he's done in terms of progression in the last 3 years. He's gone from 57 receptions to 82 to 100. He's had 10 touchdowns, 8 touchdowns, and 10 touchdowns in the last 3 consecutive seasons. On top of the fact that since 2019, he's had 40 red zone targets. 40 red zone targets. A lot of wide receivers in 5-year spans don't see that much. But in this respective offense, he gets open. And Russell Wilson finds security in the fact that he's going to throw the ball in Tyler Lockett's direction. And yes, there were games last year that were blown out of proportion. He had 20 total targets against the Arizona Cardinals. But that's because they couldn't guard him. Why not continue to abuse that and find a lot of value out of it? But either way, I think as this offense continues to progress, they bring in Shane Waldron. They're going to throw the ball way more this upcoming season. With Tyler Lockett's presence, not only with a touchdown upside, 40 targets in the last 2 seasons, leading to 15 receiving red zone touchdowns. On top of the fact that last season alone, the guy had 5 receiving touchdowns from inside the 5-yard line. My gosh, this is a safety blanket for Russell Wilson. They're going to throw the ball more. Tyler Lockett's going to continue to be another solid wide receiver in that wide receiver 2 range. I mean, in just the last 3 seasons alone, he's been a top 15 wide receiver every year in fantasy. And yes, you could anticipate volatility, but after a while, after you're scoring 10 touchdowns a year every single year, and you're only getting more and more targets from 71 to 110 to 132, that number can continue to rise, and his stability is going to continue to just solidify there in this wide receiver 2 range. We have Brandon Aiyuk as the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. Brandon Ayuk's a fantastic option this year, as long as he's healthy. If he's the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, which it looks like he's going to be considering the way that they use Deebo Samuel in this offense, a guy that's going to be used out of the backfield, a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of screen passes. Brandon Aiyuk is the number 1 outside guy. From week 7 through 16 of the 2020 season, of course, with a plethora of quarterbacks, whether it was Garoppolo or Beathard or Mullins, the guy was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game. Throughout the span of time of week 7 through 16, of course, he only played 7 games. So obviously other wide receivers played more than him. And throughout that span of time, he was only the number 21 overall wide receiver in fantasy. But in terms of fantasy points per game, the stats that really matter, he was the number 7 amongst all wide receivers. Last season, he had 6 games of 70+ receiving yards and 4 games of at least 1 receiving touchdown. And I know a lot of people may be concerned about Deebo Samuel's presence, but even in the games that Deebo Samuel and Brandon Aiyuk started together and played together, Deebo Samuel only out-targeted him by 1 total target, 31-30. And those were the weeks 4, 5, and 6 that Brandon Aiyuk hadn't really ascended to his next level of play. I think, of course, there's a lot of upside with Brandon Aiyuk this year, especially if they trade off to Trey Lance. Aiyuk's a fantastic option. We have DJ Moore as the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. DJ Moore is in an offense that, of course, is potentially going to be far more improved at the quarterback position. Teddy Bridgewater didn't do him any favors. Teddy Bridgewater only completed 15 passing touchdowns last year, had 5 rushing touchdowns, all in the red zone, which, of course, siphoned value away from receiving options like DJ Moore and Robby Anderson. But again, DJ Moore has played with backup quarterbacks year over year over year. We've got Bridgewater last season, Kyle Allen, Cam Newton, Will Grier. We've had quarterbacks that just haven't been great. And I know Sam Darnold doesn't seem like he can be that guy, but I think in an offense that surrounds him, that protects him, he could take his steps to the next level. And when we think about what DJ Moore has done in the last 2 years, he's had back-to-back seasons of 1,000 receiving yards, and I think he's only had, 7 receiving touchdowns. He has produced his floor of production. I think his ceiling is way ahead of him in the future, and I think we're going to get there potentially this year, and that's why I think we're going to take steps forward, and DJ Moore is going to have himself a successful year in 2021. Adam Thielen's the next option. So like I mentioned in regards to Justin Jefferson, of course, Adam Thielen last year scored 14 touchdowns, averaged 14.47 fantasy points per game. But the thing about Adam Thielen last year was that his target count wasn't great. In years past, 2017 had 143 targets. In 2018, he had 155 targets. 2019 was injured. But last season alone, barely getting to 108 receiving targets isn't the greatest number. I mentioned it before. I'm expecting a lot of regression from him, mainly because Justin Jefferson is going to take over this offense. But with that said, I still expect Adam Thielen to be in that 900 to 1,000 receiving yard range and at least 6 to 7 receiving touchdowns, maybe even more. Maybe he continue to improve and, he continues to build upon his 10 plus touchdowns and is the red zone threat for this offense. But all signs kind of point to that not being the case. From weeks 13 through 17, Justin Jefferson took over the overall target share of the offense with 30%, while Adam Thielen went from 28% on his average to 19% throughout those weeks, and his red zone targets went from 62% of the offensive shares to 35%. So all signs point to Justin Jefferson taking over, Adam Thielen taking a backseat this year, which of course I'm sure he doesn't mind with the number 2 wide receiver of this Minnesota Vikings offense still being very valuable. I mean, we go in years past, back to 2018, him and Stefon Diggs both finished as wide receiver ones. So the number 2 on this offense, not a bad option. T. Higgins is our next wide receiver I wanted to mention. T. Higgins from weeks 2 through 10 of last season with Joe Burrow averaged 13.14 fantasy points per game. He found his full stride from weeks 6 through 10, averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game, and was the number 11 overall wide receiver throughout that time. With Joe Burrow back, the offense a little bit more healthy. We got Mixon back. We got Jamaar Chase on the outside. There is going to be, and even in my opinion, an improved offensive line in comparison to last year in terms of pass blocking. I think T. Higgins, amongst all wide receivers of the Bengals, takes the next step forward and solidifies himself as the number 1 of this team. He's going to see a lot of opportunity, and he's going to deliver on it this year. Kenny Golladay is our last option in this D tier. Kenny Golladay is often slept upon, and I don't blame people because they have the bad taste in their mouth, but it's a lot of recency bias. Let's not forget, Kenny Golladay was a wide receiver 1 in 2019, 10-plus touchdowns, and in the last 4 games of the 2020 season in which he played, the guy either had 100 receiving yards or a receiving touchdown in those games. He had scored 14 fantasy points plus in every single one of those games in a half PPR scoring format. If we want to talk about the last 12 games he's played with Matthew Stafford alone, a good quarterback, from 2019 to 2020, the guy was averaging 14.77 fantasy points per game. And of course, he's a red zone target. He's a deep ball target. He is 6'5" plus, and he's a big body wide receiver that's going to be an easy target because his wingspan is so big. So even if Daniel Jones is throwing wobbly passes, I still think because he's going to be the number 1 of this team and he's going to see 120 plus targets, yes, he'll probably catch the ball 80 times, but it's going to lead to a lot of fantasy productivity. That's why we have him here in the D tier. We move on to our next tier of wide receivers, beginning with Chase Claypool. I know a lot of people like Chase Claypool. 109 total targets last year for 62 receptions, 873 receiving yards, and 11 total touchdowns. That's the whole question. Is Chase Claypool going to match his touchdown count? And if not, is he going to be able to catch more than 60% of his offensive targets? Because if he's not going to be able to do the latter, then the prior is going to be a dependency. He's going to need the touchdowns on a weekly basis. I mean, even when we look at the playoff game against the Cleveland Browns, the guy had himself 2 receiving touchdowns. So he's either a boom player or a bust player. We saw that last year, a couple games throughout the year in which he had less than 2 fantasy points. A couple of those definitely did burn a lot of us. Even in the back end of the season, when Diontae Johnson and JuJu Smith were really rolling, even Eric Ebron, we saw a little bit of a faded production from Chase Claypool, but he is a big part of this offense, and maybe his year 2 stride takes him to the next level as he continues to get more opportunity, has a full offseason to understand the playbook, and gets more rapport with Ben Roethlisberger. Because again, early on in the season, week 1, he wasn't even really in the rotation. It was only until week 2, that breakout performance, that he actually caught the attention of this offense and went to the next level. Odell Beckham Jr. Listen, OBJ, he's a great wide receiver. But I think his limitation is set to what Kevin Stefanski and this offense is going to be able to produce in the passing game. They're a run-first scheme. We all know that. And what I think about OBJ is he's pretty much the Stefon Diggs of this offense in the terms of what Stefon Diggs was to Kevin Stefanski's Minnesota Vikings offense. That's pretty much 1,000 receiving yards, 6 potential receiving, maybe 6 or 7 receiving touchdowns, 80 receptions. That's it. I don't expect anything more. So pretty much whatever Odell Beckham Jr. produced in 2019, I expect him to produce here in 2021. It may not be exciting, may not be sexy, but that's just what it is. That's just how the offense is built. Corey Davis is the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. Now, a lot of people may not believe in Corey Davis, but I think considering the fact that he's going to be the number one of the New York Jets, he is one of the more undervalued receiving options going into our 2021 drafts. The fact that, again, he's coming off of a career-defining season in which he had a great year with Ryan Tannehill. In fact, in the games in which he was obviously given ample opportunity with the Tennessee Titans, he was a great receiving option. In fact, if you go ahead and you eliminate the 4 games in which he had less than 3 receiving targets, I found that Corey Davis was averaging 14.75 fantasy points per game. So again, with opportunity comes success in fantasy football. I expect Corey Davis to be the number one, see himself over 120 targets this year, and find himself a lot of production. In fact, in the preseason alone, he's played 14 snaps. In those 14 snaps, 10 targets from Zach Wilson. Big number right there that I'm going to continue to ride home this offseason. We have Robby Anderson as the next option. I think Robby Anderson has himself great potential, mainly because he's coming off of a season in which he produced his first 1,000-yard year. On top of the fact that he's going to be rejoining Sam Darnold. Of course, they already have a chemistry. Last season, when Robby Anderson was given the opportunity of 7+ targets, he was averaging about 9.32 fantasy points per game. Though those numbers aren't great, it's because the touchdown totals weren't up. Again, Teddy Bridgewater only threw 15 passing touchdowns last year. I think the touchdowns go up. I think the chemistry in terms of yardage and receptions, they're going to stay similar. And then I think Robby Anderson maybe takes a couple steps forward, gets into that double-digit fantasy point per game average, potentially 11+ points. I think he's a great option this year, especially considering the Carolina Panthers with Christian McCaffrey are a significantly better offense because defensive coordinators certainly have to prepare for him and stack the box and kind of make sure somebody's covering him out of the backfield in comparison to Mike Davis that can catch the ball and fall over and be perfectly fine. Jerry Jeudy is our next wide receiver option for today. So here's the thing about Jerry Jeudy. I only have trust in him because of Teddy Bridgewater's presence. That's it. I think Teddy Bridgewater, because of what I just said about Robby Anderson, yes, he didn't give him the touchdown upside, but ultimately, I think Jerry Jeudy is going to fight through that, and he's going to get a lot of targets, similar to Robby Anderson, and he's going to get a lot of receiving yards. He's going to take that year 2 step, and I think he can get into this top 30 wide receiver conversation very easily based on just Teddy Bridgewater. But if we're going to move to Drew Lock, I don't know how much of that is going to sustain. I would hope it would do so, but I have my reservations. But regardless, considering Teddy Bridgewater is a safer quarterback, they just want him to be able to be a game manager. I think Jerry Jeudy is going to succeed in this offense with him under center. JuJu Smith-Schuster. He led the team in targets last year. He is a great slot wide receiver. He's found a lot of productivity there in comparison to years past where he was, the number one on the outside. Really didn't suit him well without Antonio Brown on the opposite side of the field. I think JuJu Smith-Schuster is a great option, but he's a PPR option. He is certainly going to depend on receptions. That is a fact. The yardage is going to be there. And whether or not we end up seeing Chase Claypool take that next step forward, I think JuJu Smith-Schuster is still going to have a pretty soft baseline in which he's going to see 100 total targets. I think all of these wide receivers will do so. But I just think that in terms of touchdowns and the average depth of target, considering he's playing in the slot, it doesn't really give him that much more upside in the receiving game in terms of total yardage. So overall, I think JuJu Smith is a great option. But in comparison to his teammates, a little bit of a discount play. The next wide receiver I want to talk about is Jamaar Chase. So again, he's going to be with Joe Burrow. They in 2019 captured the national championship at LSU. They should be a fantastic option together. He should see over 100 targets. He should have 1,000 receiving yards. What is the upside there? Can he become a Justin Jefferson? Can he be another LSU wide receiver that takes that step into superstardom? I think there's a potential, but because of how many other receiving options there are on this team, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Joe Mixon, I'm not sure he can immediately become that year one. And that's why I have him there, because I want to be safe with his overall productivity, and I don't want to overdraft somebody when there's so many other really good options at the wide receiver position. Courtland Sutton coming off of an ACL injury. I think, of course, with Teddy Bridgewater at the starting quarterback position, Courtland Sutton, we haven't seen much of him this offseason. I think he's supposed to even play today in the preseason games, but we haven't seen much of him. Hopefully he's a full go. This is a wide receiver that, could very easily be 1,000 yards, double-digit touchdown based on his size and stature. Very, Kenny Golladay-esque, but really hasn't been given the opportunity because the quarterback play hasn't been good enough in Denver. But I think if, in fact, Teddy Bridgewater is going to sustain this job, Courtland Sutton can very easily be in the top 36 conversation this year, even despite, the stalled process of returning from his ACL injury. Laviska Shenault is our next wide receiver option. I think he ends up being the most targeted wide receiver in this Jacksonville offense. Again, in the 27 snaps that he's played this offseason with Trevor Lawrence in the lineup, he's been targeted 11 times. The fact that Travis Etienne is out only potentially upgrades him because the short yardage game was going to potentially be Etienne, even in packages where he's lining up out wide in the slot position. So now that Laviska is going to have that all locked down, I think he has a lot of upside this year, and a lot of people may be kind of looking past him because they don't want to invest in a Jaguar. I think there's a lot of upside in Laviska Shenault being potentially a wide receiver that sits in the slot, can very easily catch the ball 90 times this year because you do have a rookie quarterback and he needs a safety blanket to dump the ball to, get the ball out of his hands so he is not sacked on a consistent basis and is not turning over the ball, going for deep routes with DJ Chark or potentially even Marvin Jones. Brandon Cooks. Again, Brandon Cooks has been traded left, right, and center. This is a wide receiver that consistently throughout his career has been a 1,000-yard guy. Can he do that with Tyrod Taylor? I think there's a potential. Am I banking on it? No. I still think he's going to find productivity because of opportunity, based on the fact that he's literally the only wide receiver on this team that I can trust. But regardless of who's at the quarterback position, we all know he's the most talented player in that offense this season. So he's going to get, a lot of opportunities. The offensive coordinator is going to set up a lot of plays for Brandon Cooks to succeed, similar to how they did last year with Deshaun Watson. I know the quarterback play will be reduced, but Brandon Cooks is going to find success this year nonetheless. Tyler Boyd's our last wide receiver option in this tier. I mean, the fact that Tyler Boyd was still out targeting T. Higgins last year when Joe Burrow was the starting quarterback there speaks volumes. I think Tyler Boyd is a safety option, another one of these slot wide receivers like a Laviska Shenault, like a Cooper Kupp, who are going to find a lot of value in the fact that even JuJu Smith-Schuster, in the fact that their target counts are going to be high because the quarterback is just trying to get the ball out of their hands. And I think Tyler Boyd pretty much fits in that scenario and potentially is a very discounted wide receiver, 3 with upside. Deebo Samuel sitting on my right shoulder is the last option here for the F tier. I think Deebo Samuel is a great option. My only issue is that, again, he's touchdown dependent to an extent. He's not going to be the number one wide receiver on this team. The number one receiving option is certainly going to be Kittle, followed by Aiyuk, and I think then Deebo Samuel is going to be the third option. And when you're the third option in a run-first offense, it kind of begins to at least scare me a bit, and that's why I have to kind of reduce him into this value. I know he's shown a lot of success in the last couple seasons, but he's also shown that he can get injured relatively easily. So we're going to kind of take it easy with Deebo, leave him at the back end of the F tier. Moving on to Marquez Callaway. He's kind of proven it this offseason. He's going to be the only wide receiver in this offense that you can trust outside of the receiving work of Alvin Kamara, which is a guarantee. With Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback, they just had a game together in the preseason, which they combined for 2 receiving touchdowns and 100-plus yards. Traquan Smith is still dealing with an injury. Marquez Callaway, a fantastic steal option this year because, again, Michael Thomas is going to be out for the first half of the season. We have Devonta Smith. Jalen Hurts is going to have to throw the ball somewhere. I think it's potentially going to go to the tight end position. A lot of Goddard and Hurts this year. But Devonta Smith was brought in to be the number one receiving option of this team. He will show eventually over time that he is the Heisman winning wide receiver for a reason. And though he has a smaller stature, he's got a lot of speed and a lot of elusiveness in order to back it up and prove that he can play at this next level. Antonio Brown. Look, Antonio Brown is coming off of a year in which he won a Super Bowl. At the back end of the regular season, had 3 consecutive games of at least 1 receiving touchdown. So he's coming off of a hot season. And I think, of course, we know Brady loves him. He lived at Brady's house for a majority of last year until he got settled with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Antonio Brown is pretty much just in line to be the wide receiver 3 of this offense. But in an offense that's been throwing the ball about 626 times per year on average since Bruce Arians has got there, I think Antonio Brown could very easily see himself 70 receptions and in an offense that is just going to continue to score and nobody's really going to be able to stop them. Antonio Brown could be a great value if the touchdowns are there with him. Marvin Jones, another Jaguars wide receiver I find a lot of confidence with. If we've gone ahead and just looked at the statistics from this offseason, Trevor Lawrence has funnel targeted Laviska Shenault and Marvin Jones. That is going to continue. Marvin Jones was brought in because Darrell Bevell was the former offensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions, now of the Jaguars. So he brings over Marvin Jones from the Detroit Lions because, of course, there's a familiarity, there's a comfort, and Trevor Lawrence needs a veteran number 1 wide receiver. That'll be Marvin Jones on the outside. He scored 9+ touchdowns 3 out of the last 4 seasons with the Detroit Lions. I think that can continue this year if he's given the red zone opportunity. Jacoby Myers. Jacoby Myers, in my opinion, is maybe one of the most slept-on wide receivers. I think eventually when Cam is a starting quarterback, I mean, of course, with Cam last year, Jakobi Meyers was a great wide receiver option despite his lack of touchdown ability because, again, Cam wasn't throwing touchdowns last year because of his arm. But whether it is Cam and or Mac Jones, Jakobi Meyers is a fantastic potential option to be a wide receiver 3 this year. A lot of people aren't really paying attention to him or giving him at least the spotlight. I wanted to go ahead and do so right now because, again, if you just go look at his stats and what we've heard this offseason from training camp and how much of a rapport he has with Mac Jones, it's only a matter of time until both those guys take over for the New England Patriots offense. Will Fuller is the last option here in this G tier. Will Fuller is going to be suspended for the first game. Now, I know the last time we saw Will Fuller, the guy was averaging about 15 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format with Deshaun Watson as his quarterback. But Will Fuller has never been able to stay healthy. The only reason he was healthy last year is because he was on PEDs. And if, in fact, Will Fuller is going to be this guy that's going to be out every other week with a hamstring injury, we can't trust him. And he's going to be on the bench more often than he's going to be in our lineup. And even when he's in our lineup, could end up burning us if Tua is not up to the level of what Deshaun Watson was last year. Mike Williams is the beginning of our H tier. In fact, I kind of want to clump together the H tier to an extent, just to give you a little bit of perspective. These are wide receivers that, in my opinion, either have a lot of stability or have a lot of upside. So specifically, I think Cole Beasley, having himself over 100 targets each of the last 2 years, getting himself a lot of PPR production there, the fact that he's averaged about 13 fantasy points per game in the last 2 seasons alone, those are great options. Now, Mike Williams in that same vein, if he stays fully healthy, could be the number 2 wide receiver of this offense, obviously being the third receiving option behind Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler, but has a lot of touchdown upside in an offense that should be throwing 35-plus touchdowns with Justin Herbert. So why not with a big body wide receiver like Williams? Now, Michael Pittman Jr. and Darnell Mooney are the guys that have the big upside this year. Michael Pittman should honestly be the number 1 wide receiver of the Indianapolis Colts offense. Of course, Carson Wentz as a starting quarterback's got to throw the ball somewhere. He doesn't have the Zach Ertz to feed the ball to. He's going to have Mo Alley Cox. And yes, it's a run-first scheme, but Michael Pittman's going to have to carry in the receiving game, which I think he'll definitely step up and end up doing so this year because, T.Y. Hilton has seen some regression in the last couple seasons. Darnell Mooney, on the other hand, he's shown some flashes of being able to be a great wide receiver last year. Obviously, 150 targets per season going in the direction of Allen Robinson hurts his value, but I think being the number 2 wide receiver of an Andy Dalton or Justin Fields offense could be very beneficial for him, considering there's no more Anthony Miller, and he is literally the only other receiving option in this offense that I can trust in right now. The last options I want to mention, I'm going to go ahead and throw them up all on screen together. I just thought of guys that I wanted to just throw out here that could potentially be in this I tier, guys that are either PPR dependent and end up getting a lot of receptions there, like Jarvis Landry, touchdown dependent like Marquise Brown, or health dependent like Devontae Parker. I mean, Devontae Parker was the number 1 wide receiver in 2019. If Tua's up to task and he's healthy, he could return to form. Jarvis Landry used to be a wide receiver 1 back in the day for the Miami Dolphins, but nonetheless was a decent 1,000 receiving yard wide receiver for the Browns. He can get back to that if Baker allows him to. Marquise Brown has shown a lot of flashes of being a red zone threat, but it's a matter of whether he can get there. There's a lot of wide receivers we mentioned today, and there's a lot of other wide receivers that we haven't. There's another 40 plus I could talk about, but I've been talking for a while. This is a very long video. I want to get this out to you guys as quickly as I can. So I want to thank you guys for, of course, supporting the channel, watching today's video. Make sure you click that like button down below and subscribe to the channel. I cannot thank you guys enough for the support, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for you guys to subscribe and help us join and grow this community out this upcoming season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, which we'll be talking about, I think we'll talk about quarterbacks tomorrow. I'll see you guys. Peace.